Before the sun rises over northern Mesopotamia, the ruins of an ancient city lie silent. Broken stone corridors stretch into darkness. Walls once carved with scenes of victory now crumble beneath the wind. This was Nimrud, a place where fear was engineered, recorded, and weaponized. Here, long before Rome or Persia reached their height, kings ruled through terror with absolute precision. Their victories were not whispered. They were carved into stone. Their punishments were not hidden. They were displayed. Every flayed body, every severed head, every burned city was meant to send a message far beyond the battlefield. This was Assyria. For centuries, the name alone was enough to empty cities before the first arrow was loosed. Entire regions surrendered without resistance, not because Assyria was always present, but because memory was. The memory of what happened to those who resisted. At its height, this empire stretched farther than any power before it. From a Mediterranean coastline to the mountains of Iran, from the plains of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt. No army on earth could challenge it directly. No king slept easily knowing Assyrian banners were near. And yet, despite its overwhelming strength, despite its unmatched military machine, this empire collapsed with shocking speed. Its cities burned, its people scattered, its legacy buried beneath ash and sand. This is the story of how Assyria rose from a modest river city into history's most feared empire, and how terror itself became the seed of its destruction. Long before the empire terrified the world, Assyria was merely a settlement on the banks of the Tigris River. Around 2600 BC, the city of Ashur existed as a trading hub, overshadowed by powerful southern kingdoms like Sumer and Akkad. It was not wealth that defined the Assyrians in these early centuries. It was endurance. Surrounded by hostile terrain and stronger neighbors, Assyria learned early that survival required aggression. Their chief god, Ashur, was not a nurturing deity. He was a god of command, warfare, and divine authority. To serve Ashur was to conquer in his name. 4 generations, Assyria waited, then slowly began to strike. By the late 2nd millennium BC, Assyrian kings launched campaigns beyond their borders. They did not merely raid, they occupied, they fortified, they learned. Every battle refined their tactics. Every conquest strengthened their system. The Middle Assyrian kings built the foundation, disciplined infantry, organized logistics, fortified cities, and administrative control. But what they created was only a blueprint. The true nightmare would come later. That nightmare began in the 9th century BC. Ashurnasirpal II did not inherit an empire. He forged one with blood. When he took the throne, he reshaped warfare into a spectacle of fear. Cities that resisted were annihilated, not quietly, but theatrically. Survivors were left alive only to spread the story. He marched with armies larger and more organized than anything the region had seen. Iron weapons replaced bronze. Siege engines smashed walls once thought impenetrable. Cavalry moved faster than enemies could react. After victory, Ashurnasirpal did not simply collect tribute. He erased identities. Populations were deported, replaced, scattered across the empire so rebellion could never take root. Fear became policy. Terror became administration. And when his campaigns ended, he built Nimrud, a capital designed not for comfort but for awe. Its palace walls were covered in reliefs showing exactly what happened to Assyria's enemies. No ambassador could walk its halls without understanding the cost of defiance. When Ashurnasirpal hosted his legendary banquet, tens of thousands attended. Kings, governors, envoys, all eating beneath stone carvings of impaled rebels and crushed cities. The message was unmistakable. Assyria had arrived, and it was watching. The terror that Ashurnasirpal unleashed did not fade with his death. If anything, it became tradition. When his son Shalmaneser III took the throne, the Assyrian Empire no longer needed to prove its cruelty. It needed to prove its permanence. Shalmaneser inherited a machine already soaked in blood, and he chose not to slow it down. Year after year, without pause, Assyrian armies marched. Campaigns were no longer occasional acts of war. They became seasonal rituals, expected, relentless, unavoidable. Every spring, the banners rose. Every summer, cities burned. Shalmaneser ruled for more than 3 decades, and nearly every one of those years was marked by war. His armies pushed westward into Syria, north into Anatolia, and south toward the Levantine coast. The goal was no longer simple conquest. It was dominance, so complete that resistance would feel pointless. The Assyrian army at this time was unmatched in organization. Infantry moved in disciplined ranks, shields overlapping, iron spearheads glinting beneath the sun. Archers advanced behind them, firing in volleys that darkened the sky. Chariots thundered across open ground, scattering enemy formations before they could react. Cavalry units, still a rarity elsewhere, gave Assyria speed no rival could match. But brute force alone was not enough. Shalmaneser understood that fear multiplied power. Every victory was documented. Every defeated king was named, humiliated, and recorded in stone. Obelisks and wall reliefs listed conquered cities like trophies, ensuring that even distant lands would hear the message. One of his most famous monuments, the Black Obelisk, shows rulers from across the region kneeling before him. Among them is Jehu of Israel, bowing low, offering tribute. The image is silent, but its meaning is deafening. Even kings now knelt to Assyria. Not all surrendered quietly. In 853 BC, an extraordinary event occurred. For the first time in memory, Assyria's enemies united. Kings who despised one another set aside rivalries and formed a coalition to halt the Assyrian advance. Armies from Damascus, Hamath, Israel, Phoenicia, and beyond gathered near the town of Karkar. It was desperation made flesh. The battle that followed was chaos. Tens of thousands clashed in dust and blood. Chariots smashed into shield walls. Arrows fell in endless rain. The earth itself was said to tremble beneath the weight of men and horses. Assyrian records claim victory, as they always did. But the truth may be more complex. The coalition was battered, but not annihilated. What mattered most was not who won the field that day, but what the battle revealed. Even united, Assyria's enemies could barely survive. And unity never lasted. In the years that followed, Shalmaneser returned again and again. Cities that had dared to resist were punished relentlessly. Tribute grew heavier. Hostages were taken. Governors loyal to Nineveh replaced local rulers. The empire tightened its grip, one province at a time. By the end of Shalmaneser's reign, Assyria dominated the Near East, but cracks were beginning to form. Endless war strained the state. Power concentrated among generals and officials. When rebellion erupted at home, the empire briefly faltered. But Assyria did not collapse. It adapted. In 745 BC, a new figure seized the throne, Tiglath-Pileser III. He was not merely a conqueror. He was a system builder. Where earlier kings expanded through terror alone, Tiglath-Pileser reshaped the empire from its foundations. He understood something critical. Fear conquered cities, but administration kept them. Under his rule, the Assyrian army became permanent. Soldiers were no longer seasonal levies. They were professionals, paid, equipped, trained year-round. Logistics were standardized. Supply routes mapped. Weapons mass-produced. War became an industry. At the same time, Tiglath-Pileser dismantled the old nobility. Power no longer rested with ancient families who ruled provinces like private kingdoms. Instead, loyal governors were appointed directly by the king. Their authority depended on obedience, not heritage. Rebellion now meant death. With this system in place, Assyria exploded outward. The kingdom of Urartu II, once a formidable rival in the north, was shattered. Syria was crushed. Damascus fell. The kingdom of Israel was dismembered, its people deported in waves. Entire populations were uprooted and resettled hundreds of miles away. Farmers turned into laborers. Warriors turned into strangers in foreign lands. This was not random cruelty. It was calculated control. A people without roots could not rebel. By the time Tiglath-Pileser marched south and crowned himself king of Babylon, Assyria had achieved something unprecedented. North and south, once divided for centuries, were now ruled by a single will. From the mountains to the sea, there was no escape from Assyrian authority. When he died, the empire he left behind was vast, efficient, and utterly merciless. His successors would inherit both its strength and its burden. Sargon II came to power amid uncertainty, his claim challenged, his legitimacy questioned. He answered doubt the only way Assyria knew how, with conquest. He crushed revolts in Babylon, extinguished resistance in the west, and completed the destruction of Israelite autonomy. Then he did something no Assyrian king had done before. He built an entirely new capital. Dur-Sharrukin rose from the ground as a monument to dominance. Its walls were massive, its gates guarded by colossal winged bulls, its reliefs carved with scenes of divine favor and military triumph. This city was not meant to be lived in peacefully. It was meant to intimidate. Every visitor was meant to feel small. Yet even as Sargon expanded Assyria's borders, fate dealt him a symbolic blow. He died on campaign, far from home. His body was never recovered, a horrifying omen in Assyrian belief. A king without burial was a king cursed. The throne passed to his son, Sennacherib. Where his predecessors conquered to expand, Sennacherib conquered to punish. He moved the capital to Nineveh and transformed it into the greatest city on earth. Massive walls enclosed it. Palaces rose with halls longer than football fields. Aqueducts carried water across valleys. Gardens bloomed where none should have. But beyond the walls, Sennacherib's reputation was forged in fire. Cities that rebelled were erased. Lachish was besieged, stormed, and destroyed. Its people were marched away in chains. The event was immortalized in stone panels showing every moment. The rams striking the walls, the defenders impaled, the captives paraded before the king. These were not records for history. They were warnings for the living. When Babylon defied him and murdered his son, Sennacherib unleashed total annihilation. Temples were torn down, statues smashed, canals diverted to flood ruins. The ancient city, sacred for centuries, was reduced to mud and silence. Even many Assyrians were shaken. And then, in a moment of bitter irony, Sennacherib himself was murdered, struck down by his own sons within the empire he ruled with terror. Assyria had reached its peak, and it had begun to rot from within. Esarhaddon did not ascend the throne easily. The empire he inherited was powerful, but unstable, shaken by assassination and scarred by internal betrayal. Before he could look outward, he had to survive inward. His first acts were not against foreign enemies, but against his own blood. Brothers who contested his claim were hunted down, executed, or driven into exile. Only when the throne was secure did Esarhaddon turn his gaze beyond Assyria's borders. Unlike his father, Esarhaddon ruled with a calculated balance of terror and repair. He rebuilt Babylon, a city Sennacherib had annihilated, not out of mercy, but necessity. Babylon was too important, spiritually, economically, symbolically, to remain in ruins. Temples were restored, gods returned, and priests appeased. The message was subtle but powerful. Assyria could destroy and resurrect. Yet peace was never the empire's true language. To the west and south, Egypt loomed, ancient, wealthy, proud, and defiant. For centuries, Egyptian pharaohs had meddled in Levantine affairs, supporting rebellions against Assyrian control. Esarhaddon resolved to end this interference permanently. The march into Egypt was unlike any campaign before it. Assyrian armies crossed deserts, navigated hostile terrain, and fought forces trained in entirely different traditions of war. Egyptian chariots clashed with Assyrian cavalry. Nubian archers met ironclad infantry. In 671 BC, the impossible happened. Memphis fell. The Assyrian army stormed the city, capturing Pharaoh Taharka's family, court officials, and treasures beyond counting. Temples were looted. Statues of gods were carried north as trophies. For the first time in history, Egypt bowed to a foreign empire from Mesopotamia. At that moment, Assyria ruled more land than any empire before it. From the deserts of Libya to the mountains of Iran, from Anatolia to the Nile, all roads led to Nineveh. Tribute flowed in endless streams: gold, silver, ivory, horses, labor, and lives. But empire at this scale was fragile. Esarhaddon died on campaign, marching once more toward Egypt, leaving behind a realm so vast that no single ruler could easily control it. To prevent civil war, he divided power between his sons. Ashurbanipal would rule Assyria. His elder brother, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, would rule Babylon as a vassal. It was a compromise born of fear, and it failed. Ashurbanipal was unlike any king before him. He was trained not only in war, but in scholarship. He could read and write, a rare skill among kings. He studied omens, rituals, medicine, mathematics, and ancient myths. He surrounded himself with scribes and scholars, ordering texts copied from every corner of the empire. Yet this intellectual king was also one of the most violent rulers the ancient world ever produced. When rebellion erupted, and it always did, Ashurbanipal responded with overwhelming force. In the east, the kingdom of Elam became his obsession. Campaign after campaign tore through its cities. Fields were burned, canals destroyed, populations slaughtered or deported. Reliefs from his palace show the aftermath in merciless detail. Enemies flayed alive, tongues torn out, heads piled in pyramids. These were not exaggerations. Ashurbanipal wanted posterity to see exactly what resistance earned. Then came the betrayal that shattered the empire's fragile balance. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, king of Babylon and Ashurbanipal's own brother, rebelled. He gathered allies from every corner of Assyria's enemies: Elamites, Arabs, Chaldeans, Arameans, and declared independence. What followed was one of the most brutal civil wars in ancient history. For years, Assyrian armies encircled Babylon. Supply lines were cut. Fields were destroyed. Starvation set in. Ancient texts describe horrors within the city, famine so severe that people turned on one another. When Babylon finally fell, the revenge was absolute. Ashurbanipal erased his brother's allies from history. Elam was annihilated so completely that its great cities were never rebuilt. Temples were razed, tombs violated, statues smashed and carried off. The land itself was rendered uninhabitable. And yet, in a cruel paradox, Ashurbanipal also preserved humanity's past. Within Nineveh, he created the greatest library the ancient world had ever known. Tens of thousands of clay tablets were collected. Myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh, astronomical records, medical treatises, legal codes, and ritual texts. Knowledge from Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and beyond was gathered under one roof. It was an act of obsession. Ashurbanipal believed that to rule the world, one must understand it completely. But even as knowledge was preserved, the empire decayed. Endless war drained resources. Provinces grew restless. The military elite fractured into rival factions. After around 631 BC, Ashurbanipal vanishes from the historical record. No grand monument marks his death. No clear succession follows. Assyria entered a silence more dangerous than any invasion. Without a strong king, rebellion spread. Former vassals sensed weakness. Old enemies remembered their suffering and waited. The Medes rose in the east. The Babylonians rose in the south. Together, they formed a coalition once unthinkable. This time, it was Assyria that stood alone. In 612 BC, the allied armies marched on Nineveh itself. The city that had terrified the world was besieged. Its mighty walls were breached. Fires consumed palaces. The great library burned, baking its clay tablets hard enough to survive millennia beneath the rubble. The last Assyrian king died defending the city. By 609 BC, the empire was gone. No gradual decline. No peaceful transition. One moment the greatest power on earth, the next erased. Cities were abandoned. Canals filled with silt. The name Assyria faded from maps and memory. For centuries, the world forgot. Yet the echo remained. Later empires copied Assyrian roads, provinces, intelligence systems, and military discipline. Biblical prophets remembered Assyria as divine punishment. Greek historians remembered it as the first empire of terror. And buried beneath the soil, the tablets waited. When modern archaeologists uncovered Nineveh and Nimrud, the empire rose again, not in power, but in memory. Its king spoke once more through stone and clay, telling a story of ambition without restraint. Assyria taught the world how to rule through fear, and how fear, in the end, destroys even the strongest empires. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of Nineveh, something unprecedented had occurred. For the first time in centuries, the Near East existed without Assyria. No armies marched from the north. No tribute collectors arrived at city gates. No royal messengers carried threats sealed with iron authority. The silence was unsettling. For generations, Assyria had been the axis around which power revolved. Its disappearance created a vacuum so vast that even its enemies struggled to comprehend it. Cities once ruled by fear now faced a different terror, uncertainty. The Medes and Babylonians, victorious but exhausted, divided the spoils. They dismantled Assyrian fortresses stone by stone, not merely for conquest, but to erase memory. Palaces were looted. Statues were mutilated. Faces of kings were slashed, noses broken, eyes gouged out. This was symbolic violence, an attempt to destroy not just the empire, but the idea of it. Yet erasure is never complete. Across the former Assyrian heartland, ordinary people remained. Farmers returned to scorched fields. Refugees wandered among ruins. Former soldiers, once the terror of the world, faded into anonymity. Their weapons rusted. Their discipline dissolved. The empire that had demanded absolute obedience could no longer even protect its own people. And still, Assyria's influence refused to die. The Babylonians who reclaimed power adopted Assyrian administrative systems almost immediately. Provinces, taxation, census records, and intelligence networks, all inherited from the empire they had just destroyed. Even the Medes, once tribal rivals, organized their rule along Assyrian lines. Power, it seemed, left fingerprints. Far to the east, a rising Persian state studied Assyrian methods with care. When Cyrus and his successors built their empire, they avoided Assyria's excesses, but kept its efficiency. Roads, governors, couriers, imperial law. These were Assyrian ideas reborn under a softer hand. The terror faded. The structure endured. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Nineveh, something extraordinary happened by accident. The fires that consumed Ashurbanipal's palace hardened the clay tablets of the great library, baking them like pottery. Buried beneath collapsed walls, they waited, silent witnesses to a vanished world. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Greeks marched east. Romans followed. The land changed rulers countless times, but Assyria remained a ghost, referenced in scripture, cursed in prophecy, half-remembered in legend. To the biblical writers, Assyria was divine punishment. To Greek historians, it was a cautionary tale. To later generations, it was almost myth. Then, in the 19th century, men digging in the sands of Iraq struck stone. Reliefs emerged from the earth. Vast panels carved with marching armies, sieges, executions, kings standing beneath winged gods. At first, no one could read the strange wedge-shaped writing, but slowly, patiently, scholars unlocked its code. The Assyrians began to speak again. They told their own story, not softened, not ashamed. Kings boasted of terror. They glorified destruction. They believed brutality was proof of divine favor. Their words revealed a civilization convinced that fear was order and mercy was weakness. And yet, within those same tablets, there was poetry. There were prayers for healing, treatises on medicine, star charts mapping the heavens, stories of friendship, loss, and mortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving epic, survived because Assyria preserved it. This contradiction defines the empire more than any battle. Assyria was not simply cruel. It was intensely human. It feared chaos. It worshipped control. It believed the world was fragile and must be held together by force. Every rebellion threatened cosmic order. Every enemy was an agent of disorder. So the kings responded with overwhelming violence, convinced they were saving civilization itself. But civilization cannot be held together by terror forever. Assyria collapsed, not because it was weak, but because it was exhausted. Endless war drained its strength. Fear bred hatred. Hatred united enemies. And when the final blow came, no one rose to defend it. No allies marched to Nineveh's aid. No provinces rushed to its rescue. Only silence answered its call. That may be Assyria's greatest lesson. Power built solely on fear creates obedience, but not loyalty. It commands silence, but never devotion. And when such power falters, it stands alone. Today, the stones of Assyrian palaces sit behind museum glass. The Lamassu, once guardians of empire, watch tourists pass with quiet indifference. Their wings no longer protect a king. Their gaze no longer terrifies cities. But their presence still whispers a warning that the greatest empires can vanish. That terror is not immortality. And that history remembers not only how civilizations rose, but how they chose to rule. The empire that once terrified the world is gone. Its echo remains. To truly understand Assyria, one must step away from the kings for a moment and look at the lives that sustained the empire. Behind every campaign, every siege, every monument carved in stone, there were countless ordinary people whose lives were shaped and often shattered by imperial ambition. The Assyrian soldier was not merely a warrior. He was a product of state discipline. From a young age, boys were trained to obey without hesitation. Drill was relentless. Formation mattered. Individual bravery was less important than cohesion. A single man was expendable. The army was eternal. Marching to last weeks, soldiers crossed rivers on temporary bridges, cut roads through forests, and hauled siege equipment across deserts. Supply trains followed behind, carrying grain, dried meat, and water skins. Failure to maintain discipline on the march could mean death, not from the enemy, but from punishment. When the army approached a city, the ritual began. First came intimidation. Messengers arrived bearing demands for surrender. They described in vivid detail what had happened to the last city that refused. If the gates opened, the city might survive, its rulers replaced, its people deported, its wealth seized. If not, destruction was certain. When resistance continued, the siege commenced. Assyrian engineers were masters of destruction. Earthen ramps were raised against walls. Battering rams protected by wicker screens hammered stone day and night. Archers provided covering fire, pinning defenders in place. Sappers dug tunnels beneath foundations, collapsing entire sections of wall without warning. For those inside the city, siege was a slow nightmare. Food ran out. Water was rationed. Disease spread. Morale collapsed long before walls fell. The Assyrians understood this and waited patiently. When the breach came, it was swift and absolute. Soldiers poured through gaps, killing defenders where they stood. Temples offered no refuge. Palaces burned. Those who resisted were slaughtered publicly. Survivors were bound, counted, and marched away. Deportation was one of Assyria's most powerful weapons. Entire populations were uprooted and resettled hundreds of miles from their homeland. Families were separated. Languages were lost. Local identities dissolved. In their place, Assyria created a controlled, mixed population that depended on the empire for survival. To the Assyrian state, this was efficiency. To the people who endured it, it was erasure. Back home, life continued beneath the shadow of the king. Cities like Nineveh, Nimrud, and Ashur were not chaotic. They were meticulously planned. Streets were organized. Markets regulated. Taxes collected with precision. The empire's bureaucracy reached into every household. Religion saturated daily life. Omens were consulted before decisions large and small. A strange birth, a lunar eclipse, an unexpected storm. All were messages from the gods. Priests interpreted these signs, advising kings on when to march, when to wait, when to strike. The gods of Assyria were demanding. They required conquest to maintain cosmic balance. War was not merely political, it was sacred. Ashur, Ishtar, Sin, Shamash, their favor justified brutality. Enemies were not just foes. They were threats to divine order. This belief hardened Assyria's worldview. Mercy became dangerous. Compromise became weakness. Every victory reinforced the idea that fear was righteousness. And for centuries, it worked. Tribute poured in. Roads connected distant provinces. Messages traveled faster than ever before. The empire functioned like a living organism, with Nineveh as its beating heart. But organisms tire. As decades of war passed, the human cost grew unbearable. Fields lay fallow as farmers were drafted. Trade routes suffered. Rebellions flared not from ambition, but desperation. The empire responded the only way it knew how, with more violence. Each act of repression planted seeds of resentment. By the time Ashurbanipal vanished from history, Assyria was holding together by habit alone. Generals competed for power. Court factions plotted. Provincial governors tested boundaries. The empire still looked strong, but its foundation was hollow. When the Medes and Babylonians struck, they did not face a united state. They faced exhaustion. Cities surrendered not because they feared the enemy, but because they no longer believed Assyria could save them. Nineveh's walls were mighty. Its defenders were not. And so the empire fell not with a roar, but with a collapse. Afterward, the land healed slowly. Grass grew over battlefields. Rivers reclaimed canals. Memory blurred. Yet Assyria's influence continued in subtle ways. Later empires learned from its mistakes. The Persians ruled with tolerance where Assyria ruled with terror. They allowed local customs. They respected religions. They understood that loyalty lasts longer than fear. But they still used Assyrian roads. Assyrian records. Assyrian systems. The empire was gone. Its blueprint survived. Even today, when we speak of empire, we echo Assyria without realizing it. Centralized power, professional armies, intelligence networks, psychological warfare. Assyria invented the language of domination and paid the price for speaking it too loudly. The Assyrians believed the universe was fragile. To them, the world was not naturally ordered. Chaos pressed in from every direction, from foreign lands, from rebellious cities, even from within the human heart. The task of the king was not simply to rule people, but to hold the universe together through strength. Every decision was weighed against omens. Before armies marched, priests watched the skies. They studied the flight of birds, the shapes of clouds, the patterns of smoke rising from sacrificed animals. The liver of a sheep could decide the fate of a city. A crack in its surface might mean delay. A smooth mark could mean victory. Eclipses terrified Assyrian kings. When the moon darkened unexpectedly, it was believed the gods were threatening the ruler's life. To deceive fate, the courts sometimes placed a substitute king on the throne, a doomed stand-in who would bear the curse and be executed once the danger passed. Only then could the real king resume his rule. This was not superstition to them. It was survival. In such a world, hesitation was deadly. Mercy was suspicious. If chaos was always waiting to return, then violence was prevention, not cruelty. This belief shaped every layer of Assyrian society. Children learned obedience early. Craftsmen worked under quotas. Farmers delivered grain according to strict schedules. Scribes recorded everything: births, deaths, harvests, punishments. Order was documented into existence. Even art obeyed this philosophy. Assyrian reliefs do not show doubt. Kings are always calm. Enemies are always defeated. There is no chaos in the images, only dominance. The world, as Assyria depicted it, was already conquered. Reality, however, was less obedient. Each generation of kings inherited a slightly weaker empire than the one before. Not because Assyria lost power suddenly, but because maintaining absolute control demanded infinite energy. War consumed manpower. Deportations disrupted agriculture. Fear discouraged innovation. And above all, hatred accumulated quietly beyond the borders. By the late 7th century BC, the Assyrian state was fighting too many wars in too many directions, with too few people who still believed. The Medes remembered the destruction of their cities. The Babylonians remembered humiliation. The Scythians remembered slaughter. When they united, it was not ambition that drove them, it was memory. The siege of Nineveh was not merely military. It was symbolic. The attackers knew the city's reputation. They had heard the stories. They had seen the reliefs. Now they stood before the walls that once terrified the world, and they were not afraid. For months, the assault continued. Floods weakened foundations. Walls cracked. Fire spread through wooden structures. Inside the city, panic grew. The gods were silent. When Nineveh fell, it was destroyed with intention. This was not conquest, it was erasure. Temples burned. Palaces collapsed. Statues were smashed and buried face down in the dirt. The city that once defined power became a warning. Afterward, travelers passed its ruins without knowing its name. Even its location was forgotten. Assyria vanished so completely that later civilizations believed it existed only in legend. That disappearance is what makes Assyria unique. Rome fell slowly. Egypt faded gradually. Greece transformed. Assyria ended abruptly. And yet, in the ashes of its destruction, something extraordinary survived. Clay tablets. Hard, small, unassuming, they outlived armies, kings, and cities. They preserved laws, prayers, stories, fears. They recorded how the Assyrians saw themselves and how they justified their actions. They allow us to hear the empire speak in its own voice. And what it says is unsettling. Assyria believed it was saving the world through violence. It believed fear was moral. It believed domination was order. These ideas did not die with the empire. They reappear whenever power believes itself indispensable. Whenever rulers justify cruelty as necessity. Whenever security is used to excuse brutality. Whenever fear replaces trust. This is Assyria's true legacy. Not its battles, not its monuments, but its warning. The ruins of Nineveh no longer burn. The Lamassa no longer guard gates. The kings no longer speak from thrones of gold. But the question Assyria leaves behind remains alive. How much violence can a civilization use to protect itself before it becomes the very chaos it fears? The empire that terrified the ancient world answered that question the hard way. And history has been listening ever since.